Hello everyone, hope you're doing well. I thought we'd start with a little social experiment. If you could like this video, that would be lovely. Now, let's get on to the IAR-81C. What is this aircraft? Well, in update 1.79 we got a few new premiums, and one of the aircraft ones was for Italy, and it is in the form of the fighter you see before you. Now, what has striked a lot of people the wrong way, I suppose would be the way to say it, is the fact that this is a Romanian aircraft, and for the Romanians before in the game, they have actually been put in the German tree. We have a BF-109, which is of Romanian origin, and I also believe we have some other premiums of Romanian origin which find themselves in the German tree. But this one was given to the Italians, and I believe the official reason for this was because, well, Italy needs more premiums, and to be honest, I'm completely fine with that. Most of the time, as an Italian player, you will get matched up on the same team as a German player, so therefore, you're pretty much on German teams anyway. You never get a full Italian team anymore. Those days are way gone, and I think that's because a lot of people have ground through the majority of the tree, or most of the tree that they needed, and have just kind of left it by the wayside. So what is the IAR-81C? It is a Rank 2 battle rating 2.7 premium Italian aircraft. It is armed with two MG151s with 350 rounds of ammunition, and as you can see, they're in the wings here, 175 apiece. And then, of course, two 7.92 FN Browning machine guns with 700 rounds each, so 1,400 in total. The main killing power, of course, being the MG151s, and because they are on the wings instead of centrally mounted, which you'll see with a lot of other aircraft, convergence is something you will have to take into account. If we look at the engine, we have an IAR-14K4C32 14-cylinder radial. It gives you around about 900 horsepower for the max power, and of course takeoff power 960 horsepower. It's a pretty beefy engine for 2.7, and it kind of needs to be for this aircraft, because this is not a light vehicle, especially when you look at the amount of fuel that it can carry. Here's the oil cooling system here and here, and then there are some little areas here as well. This basically means if you get shot in the center of the aircraft, you are going to spring either a fuel leak or an oil leak or both. What I've actually found with this, and this may just be anecdotal experience, my engine doesn't actually take a lot of damage. What actually takes damage on this aircraft is the fuel tanks and the oil cooling, and I don't know whether shots are getting stuck in those and not going through if I'm getting shot from behind, or if I'm just getting lucky, but the engine seems to at least last a little bit longer. But because this thing is a little bit more powerful when it comes to the engine, it's a little bit larger than a lot of the aircraft that you'll see at this BR, when it comes to fighters I should say. The overall strength of the machine when it comes to taking shots is pretty good. One of the big things with the new updates, obviously a lot of people have been talking about the cannon buff and the damage model changes. The IAR is the first fighter I've had where if I get damaged, I don't feel like I'm going to fall out of the sky. I feel like I'm still combat effective, which is always lovely to see. If we see the armor on this machine, you have some bulletproof glass, 75mm, so good luck getting through that if you're trying to kill the pilot. And then of course we have 12.7mm behind him in this setting here. Self-sealing fuel tanks, so you won't lose all your fuel if they get punctured, always nice. And modification-wise, well, remember, this is a premium vehicle, so therefore you get all of the modifications for free, and therefore you don't have to worry about grinding any of them out. So the main thing you have to focus on is secondary weapons and your belts. So the 7.92 Brownings, you start off with a default, a lot of balls and a lot of AP, so therefore a lot of penetrating power. I personally like the APT, APAI, API. I have been loving more and more the idea of having AP instead of I rounds. I kind of went off incendiary stuff in a big way, like if, let's say, a majority of your rounds are incendiary, because of the French changes back in the day with the 7.5mm machine guns. What happened with those is they were annihilated because penetration was basically added to them and everything got a basic model of armor, meaning that they couldn't pen anything anymore. So AP has become much more useful in the long run. So for me, universal belts, if you are confident with the 792s, you take stealth because it's just a better belt with more of the good stuff. When it comes to the offensive 20mm, the MG151s, each belt that you find is incredibly good. Now, you will see some players talk about how penetration is more better. Some players will talk about more, using the fragmentation incendiary or using the HEI, of course, the Mininger shots and all of that. For me, I like to stick with air targets. The reason for this is because you get an API, you get a bunch of Mininger shots, and you also get an incendiary tracer shell, so you're able to see where you're shooting. So overall, if one of these rounds hit, as long as it's not the API one, you're going to annihilate whatever you hit. It's a really good gun right now. I would actually say the MG151 is my favorite 20mm to use in the game, and it's just because it's ripping through everything. On top of this, the IAR actually gets access to some secondary weapons, which is lovely to see. It has two forms. You get the bombs, so two 50s, 250s, and then a 250 and 250s. These were added after updates 1.79, that's why I don't have them purchased. And then you also get some rockets, the WFR GR21s, two of them, and then you have the two rockets and of course the 250. So this is not just a machine which is going to be competent when it comes to fighting. It's going to be able to land, rearm in aerialistic, and be able to go out again and do some damage to ground forces. It also means that its versatility is a little bit better, meaning that ground realistic may be a calling for it. What we're seeing a lot of in ground realistic is this idea of the aircraft which is a fighter, which has a lot of secondary armaments. The P-47, P-51s come to mind. People take the Spitfires, the BF-109s, even though they don't have a lot of secondary weapons, they have enough, and then they're able to fight afterwards. This is how I see the IAR. Now, at the moment, all you have is the P-40 Leoncello at 3.3, and at 3.3, for the Italians, you have the C-202EC, with no secondary armaments. You can take the medium bombers if you feel like. Not exactly meta. You could take the Spitfire Mark 5B Trop if you feel like it, but once again, no secondary weapons. If you want to take the P108A Series 2 and hang yourself from a tree, I mean, you can do that too, because, well, let's just say it's not the best vehicle. I'm sure there are some wonderful highlight montages on YouTube, but that's really about it from that machine. But then you have the Sparvieros. So the IAR at 3.3 is really, or at 2.7 moving up to 3.3, is one of the only planes which fills this role of what you want in ground realistic, which is this idea of a fighter which can also bomb. So technically this thing can take out two ground targets, not soft ground targets, and then it is backed up by MG151s and 792s, so you'll be able to do damage to lighter vehicles and also be combat effective in the air. Once Navy comes around as well, those MG151s are going to tear apart everything, and it's going to be useful in that too. So overall, useful in all of the game modes, not just air realistic, meaning that as a premium, it's a pretty good bang for your buck when you see it like that. Obviously, I'm not going to tell you what to do with your money, but I'm just saying that this isn't just going to be effective in one game mode, it's going to be good across the board. So what we're going to do is we're going to get into some history and then some gameplay. To start off with, the IAR actually stands for Industria Aeronautica Romana, and in 1938 they unveiled a Romanian-produced IAR-80 piston engine. Now before this they actually made a few biplane engines which were license built from British designs, but the IAR-80 was a piston-engined single-seat fighter which was a promising aircraft compared to its contemporaries at the time. The aircraft served in the Royal Romanian Air Force and primarily appeared in two major variants, designated simply the IAR-80 and the IAR-81. A total of 346 of them were built, and both aircraft types were known to be produced, and the fighters pressed on into wartime service up to 1944. By the time of this, though, in 1944, as a lot of aircraft from 1938 found, they were kind of useless compared to the new and more powerful vehicles that were around at the time. So the aircraft was good in 1938, but by the time it actually got to the point where it was used its most, it wasn't exactly the cream of the crop. The aircraft also suffered throughout its production life due to a shortage of adequate armament to actually fit the design, so something that a lot of French aircraft ran into as well. So the IAR-80 was actually born out of a 1930s Romanian fighter requirement. The IAR was the only one of the 3 state-created aviation companies to answer the call locally, making it meaning that it would be easier to produce, it would be easier to streamline. So they offered up several complete prototypes for review, and while external providers were also considered, as I said, you do have stuff like, national identity to think about. You also have to think about the ease and access to a local company compared to a global company. So overall, all of these factors will have been considered when choosing IAR to actually build this. The original specification for the fighter requirements actually netted the Polish company PZL the contract for its high monoplane, the PZL P11 series. IAR was clearly a player in the market though, and even though future contracts were won by PZL over IAR's designs, the IAR gained valuable knowledge by taking on licensed production of these Polish aircraft, along with some French designs as well. So as you can see, the IAR brand was growing, maybe not through originality, but at least through experience in helping others. The IAR design team proceeded in its fighter efforts and began taking apart the winning PZL P-24 design, so some reverse engineering. And the IAR, to put it lightly, let's say, the IAR design was then it incorporated the tail section and the front-end fuselage of the PZL design into its own aircraft, and the high monoplane wings of previous PZL production fighters was abandoned in favor of the more modern low-wing monoplane mounting. And by the time of 1938, they were moving away, well, most countries, the majority of countries, were moving away from the biplane idea to the monoplane. The wing component was taken straight from an Italian Savio Marchetti bomber design, funny enough, and in essence the IAR-80 would be a piece together from various working designs and re-engineered to make it actually work. Even the open cockpit approach, which was very popular with the Italians, it was very popular with the Polish pilots as well, were even considered and put into the prototype, which is kind of surprising because once again that's some technology which was at the time dying as well. The IAR design team then built its first prototype, or completed its first prototype in 1938, and the aircraft had an IAR version of the French license-produced Nomron 14K2 Mistral Major engine, which is a powerplant brand that IAR had already achieved a good deal of experience constructing at their plant. The follow-up flights shown that the prototype was to produce favorable results for what they were looking for, especially when it came to maneuverability. Not exactly sure in-game I would agree with that, but, obviously realism and the game are slightly different, or historically I should say. And then also it had a completely arranged airframe, which also helps as well. The following year would be spent mostly on addressing the issues which came from the test flights, which generally is how this stuff goes. You create an initial prototype, then you refine it, and then create the production model. Very much the similar process that we see with every other country out there. So the new Look 80 emerged with a new C36 930 horsepower engine. It also had a lengthened fuselage to accommodate the power plant, and this change forced the cockpit position back in the design, to which the pilot seat had to be raised and a bubble canopy added to improve its forward vision. So as you can see, we're now getting towards the one which we have in game. And one of the issues with having this, pushing the cockpit back, having to raise the seat, and also having the bubble canopy is something that the Germans ran into as well, and with their BF-109s. A lot of BF-109s were actually lost due to crashes on landing, because if the pilot was landing, they weren't able to see in front of them. But since the plane had to be angled a specific way to land, and then you wouldn't be able to see in front of you. Unfortunately, the IAR had the same issue. Obviously, in game this doesn't affect us, but in real life, if you have a cockpit which is sat back, then that is something you have to consider. Along with these changes, there was additional fuel which was added with the newly created fuselage spaces, effectively increasing the aircraft's original intended range, and the armament was 2 Browning 7.92 machine guns, and the production models were supposed to mount a full set of 6 7.92mm machine guns, all in the wings, 3 to a wing. So that is a decent amount, 1938. I mean, compared to some of its contemporaries, it's more, such as the ME or BF-109 series. Compared to the Spitfire series, not so much. There was actually a competition between the 80 and the HE-112, the aircraft which wasn't put into mass production by the Germans, beaten out by the BF-109. And it was put forth with the IAR design, and it actually came out ahead. The 80 was able to beat the 112, which was lovely to see. So because of this, or at least a factor of this, meant that the production of the 80 followed, with an initial order of 100 of them, but unfortunately these were delayed because of the fall of Belgium, as Fabrique Nationale was the intended armament supplier of the IAR-80. So it's not really the Romanians' fault that these were delayed, but unfortunately real life stuff sometimes gets in the way of fantasy. The armament issue was then rectified, or at least somewhat rectified, with the inclusion of Romania into the Axis fold. The control of Belgium fell to the Germans. The alliance netted Romania the much-needed guns for its 80 planes, IAR-80 planes, and this finally allowed the 80s to begin its delivery schedule into Romanian air groups for some valuable operational experience. The first 80s were made available in the January of 1941, so at this point we're seeing the E variants of the BF-109s. Some 3 years after, and maybe even some early Focke-Wulfs at this point, maybe some A1s or A0s. Some 3 years after the prototype actually came about. So 3 years of prototype to production, that's actually not bad, especially for the country the size of Romania. Production models were only allowed an armament of suite of 4 7.92 machine guns, and this obviously limited its combat effectiveness quite a lot. And then in-field feedback also resulted in the use of the K14 4C32 series engine of 960 horsepower, as many Romanian pilots felt the aircraft lacks much punch in terms of performance. So we're pretty much at the stage of having the 81C's engine at this point. Now, the future variants of the IAR-80 basically had stuff like extra guns, extra power in the engine, and overall exactly what you would see from aircraft like this, just increased stuff on it, whether it be bomb racks, whether it be fuel tanks. But the IAR-81, which is the one we have in game, the 81C, it was designed to be a dive bomber, which is why it may be slightly different to the IAR-80, which would be lovely to see in game one day. But the 80 is the one that the history is all based around, and the 81 is the variant of it, which we actually have. So an IAR-80A was modified. It was an economical response to the requirement, considering the atmosphere in Europe at the time, since obviously they couldn't reconstruct a new dive bomber from scratch, so they took some of their existing stuff and decided, you know what, we're gonna build on top of this. The dive bomber derivative eventually sported a centerline bomb rack positioned for a 500-pound ordnance, and underwing racks mounting 110 bombs as well. And then the follow-up variants to the design, being the A, B, and C, they differing mostly in armament types as they became available from the Germans. So that is where we get the MG151s coming in, instead of just having the unfortunate Browning machine guns. The C itself had a top speed of 342 miles per hour, had a range of 454 miles, and a ceiling of 31,200 feet. So this aircraft was not a slow cookie, but at the point of when it was used most, during the mid-war periods, it was nothing really that satisfying, I think would be the way to go. Overall, it was a middling aircraft, very good for Romania, which was impaired by a few issues out of their control, as I said, such as the armament one. But it served its purpose. It was there when it needed to be. It did have some actually quite good success against some American aircraft near the end of the war, but this is always disputed since the American aircraft were much more designed for ground attack in the mission where they were attacked and they actually lost. So therefore, as I said, it's disputed how well the 80s and the 81s would have actually done in a head-to-head combat scenario. But anyway, let's get on to some gameplay. The IAR-81C in-game definitely has quite a lot going against it, at least when you compare it to contemporary good fighters around its BR. It's obvious to compare it to stuff like the BF-109 or the C-202 or C-205s, because, well, it's around that BR bracket, and that's generally what you'll see on your team alongside stuff like the Premium P-47 and the Focke-Wulf 190. And if you compare all of them and the 81C, what you'll find is the 81C is lacking in a few areas, but at least has a few tricks up its sleeve. So the first big issue with it, which kind of annihilates its stake in being a meta-defining vehicle, is that it has a rough climb rate, especially compared to the BF-109, which is generally seen as the gold standard, at least the F-series of BF-109. So, because of that, it will never be a fighter where if you climb into the enemy, you will be in a good position to be able to fight them on. You won't be able to have an advantage. At best, you will be on equal ground. So, because it has this issue, that means that it de facto becomes a support fighter, which I am completely partial to. I really like support fighters. I like waiting patiently that extra 1 or 2 minutes for a battle to set up, and then come in and be able to support my allies. And because of this, you will need a decent bit of patience with this aircraft. This is not something like a Spitfire, like a BF-109, like a Yakovlev, where you can dictate the battle on your terms. It is one that you will have to use to set up 1 or 2 scenarios, to catch enemies out, to be able to go after them in mischievous and aggressive tactical ways, but understand that if they ever catch on to you, they are going to have the upper hand. One of the things which is nice about the 81C is the dive rate, though. The dive rate that I found on it is that it has a good dive on it, meaning that it gains speed quickly, it has a really good roll rate at speed, but what it struggles with above around about 600, around 650, 600, that's pretty much your limit with this thing. I have hit 680 in it, but the elevator is incredibly stiff, the rudder is non-responsive, but the wings didn't rip, so at least that's nice. So the maximum you can really go is about 650, 660 in this thing, and I would say up to around 600. This thing actually handles really well when it comes to the roll rates, and it is understandable that it locks up, it's a little bit stiff, a little bit, but overall it's a good high-speed fighter for the 2.7 bracket. Now the question is a high-speed dive fighter what you need at the 2.7 bracket? Well, we've had a lot of additions to the game over the last few years which have been more focused around that idea, but the meta at these BRs has not really changed from the old school of fighter, which is pretty much a good climber, which has, well, it doesn't have to have energy retention, but it helps. And on top of that, it has a good turn, at least a good first and second turn, and then a good way to escape, whether it is to turn or whether it is to dive away. So the 81C has the dive. It is able to get away, but it will get caught quite easily since its max speed in a straight line is a lot less than some of its compatriots from other nations. Generally, you don't face those nations. Mainly, I've faced Britain and Russia. But if you come up against America, then you're going to have a few issues in that department. When it comes to another, not really an issue, but something to be aware of, a lot of aircraft have around a minimum fuel load of about 20 minutes, maybe even less nowadays. The 81C clocks in at 22 minutes, so you want to be wepping from the start to try and burn off as much of that as possible. As I talked about before, something I actually need to clarify. When I say an aircraft is heavy, I'm not talking about the weight, I'm talking about the controls of the aircraft. I've seen a lot of people, like when I say this looks heavy or this feels heavy, a lot of people have commented saying, well, it's actually quite a light aircraft. And that's completely fine. I understand, why you might get confused, because it's not the best wording on my part. But when I'm saying right now, when I use the word heavy, I mean it feels sluggish, I think is the way to say it. So with that said, with more fuel on board, of course this plane becomes sluggish. And since it is not a low-speed turn fighter, it gets even more sluggish with more fuel on board. So burning off that fuel is something you will have to do quite consistently while you are getting into battle. And you actually do have some stuff which helps you with this. You're able to WEP from the start of the airfield for around about 5 minutes, until your engine starts overheating. You can knock it back to 100% and it will not overheat, so that's really nice. You don't really have to worry about it too much. But wepping for 5 minutes, you will be able to get on par with some aircraft when it comes to altitude climbing, but the majority of them, if they are paying attention, will still outclimb you. So therefore you cannot get involved in that initial engagement like a BF-109 or something like a Spitfire would. So on top of all of this, one of the great things about it is its armament. A lot of people will look at it, a lot of people have commented that it has the wrong armament. I'm not really going to get into that here, since it's debatable at best. But two MG-151s, if they connect, they will annihilate planes that you're attacking, and all you have to do is land 1, 2, or 3 shots, and that plane will disintegrate. And I've seen that happen many times with the MG-151s. So this has happened with D520s, it's happened with bombers, it's happened with anybody that I've really shot at. And that basically means that you have a really good, stable gun platform that can do a hell of a lot of damage. Much more reliable than the Hispanos at this tier. Much more reliable than the 15mm that you find from the Germans, and also the 50s that you find from the Americans. About as reliable as the 20 that you get from the Russians. I've always really enjoyed that one on the early Yaks, and also stuff like the LA-5 and the 5FN. But because of that, it means you can set up scenarios where you dive in, attack an enemy, and dive out. But this means that positioning and tactics at the start of a battle mean a hell of a lot. It means that you have to get to a position where you are confident that the enemy can't turn too hard and can't, be able to evade your shots. So generally this is why picking a person who is already engaged in a dogfight is a great thing to do. But if you aren't able to do that, you have to make sure to try and hit them when they're not paying attention. Otherwise, if they turn, well, you're not going to be able to turn with them. Think about, if you are a more experienced player, think about the way that the old Focke-Wulfs used to fly, the Focke-Wulf D variants, or think about how the TAR 152 H1 flies right now. And that's basically how this thing flies, but a lower tier version of it. So great at certain aspects, but not great at others, as I said. A very specific, specialized aircraft. And something else to understand, which seems to be common with a lot of these new vehicles, which I'm not particularly happy about, is the rudder is stiff as hell. And I don't know why this keeps happening with all these vehicles. but it is incredibly annoying. So elevator and ailerons is what you use. Rudder is not something you can rely on at all. Overall, I've done well in this plane, playing it in that supportive fighter role. If you want something to be able to grind out the Italian tree with, and you don't have access to the standard premiums like the G55S, I would definitely still take the Spitfire premium over this one, just because the Spitfire premium fits the meta a little bit better. But if you, and also the fact that it's a higher rank, so it's more useful for rank 4, where the IAR is only useful to rank 3. But if you are interested in Romanian vehicles, or you want to learn how specific high rank fighters such as the TAR fly at lower tiers to be able to get an experience which will be much more forgiving for you when you're at the lower tiers compared to the higher tiers, then this is a good aircraft to do that. So see it as an aircraft you can use to teach yourself how to dive fight properly, because that is a skill that a lot of people don't have in War Thunder, and one which is massively underrepresented. So yeah, see it as that, and maybe you'll get some success with it like I have. I hope you all have a wonderful day, and I'll see you next time.